November 2, 1944, a muddy field outside Saint-Nicolas-de-Port in the Lorraine region of eastern France. General George S. Patton, the most feared armored commander in the American Army, climbed onto the hood of a half-track and looked down at the men drawn up in formation in front of him. Nearly 700 black tank crewmen of the 761st Tank Battalion, the first African-American armored unit ever sent into combat by the United States. Patton had personally asked for them. This was the same Patton whose private diaries recorded views on race that would end a career today. And yet here he was, telling them he did not care what color they were, only that they went up there and killed Germans. What made him ask for this battalion by name in the autumn of 1944, and what did those men do in the 183 days that followed? In the spring of 1942, the United States Army still carried on its books a document that had shaped every decision it made about African American soldiers for nearly 2 decades. It was called The Use of Negro Manpower in War, drafted by the Army War College in 1925, and its conclusions were blunt. Black soldiers, the report claimed, lacked the intelligence, initiative, and mechanical aptitude to handle complex modern equipment. They could dig, they could cook, they could drive supply trucks behind the lines, but they could not, in the Army's official judgment, operate the machines that would decide the next war. That single document justified nearly every restriction placed on black servicemen through the interwar years, and it was still guiding personnel policy when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. The war changed the arithmetic before it changed the doctrine. By early 1942, the Army needed tank crews faster than it could train white ones, and the pressure from black newspapers, from the NAACP, and from the office of Judge William Hastie inside the War Department finally cracked the wall. On April 1, 1942, at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, the 761st Tank Battalion was formally activated. It was the first African-American armored unit in United States history, and almost no one in the regular Army expected it to see combat. The battalion was placed under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Paul L. Bates, a white officer from New Jersey who had asked for the assignment when others turned it down. Bates was a former Western Maryland college football player, physically imposing and stubbornly convinced that his men would fight as well as any tank crew in the Army if they were given the same training and the same equipment. The training itself became the first battle. Camp Claiborne sat inside Rapides Parish, deep in the Jim Crow South, and the town of Alexandria, a few miles away, had already exploded in racial violence in January 1942 when white military police fired on black soldiers from another unit. The 761st trained under those conditions for months. They learned the M5 Stuart light tank first, then transitioned to the M4 Sherman medium tank in 1943. They ran gunnery ranges, maneuver exercises, and radio drills, and by the standards the Army itself set for armored battalions, they scored consistently well. Bates pushed the numbers up the chain and kept pushing, but the assumption inside the theater commands remained the same. Black tankers might be used for training. They would not be used in Europe. They would not be trusted with a decisive fight. The tanks the 761st would eventually take into combat were medium Shermans mounting a short 75mm gun, a weapon adequate for infantry support but badly overmatched against the German Panther and Tiger tanks, then dominating the European battlefield. That mismatch was true for every American tank battalion in 1944, not just the 761st, but it would matter especially for a unit that would be asked to attack again and again into terrain the Germans had chosen. None of that was on the men's minds yet at Camp Claiborne. What was on their minds was the daily reality of segregated barracks, segregated mess halls, segregated buses, and white officers who often refused to salute their black lieutenants. In September 1943, the battalion moved to Camp Hood in Central Texas for advanced tank destroyer and combined arms training, and it was at Camp Hood that the 761st gained a name that would follow it out of the war and into American memory for reasons that had nothing to do with tanks. Second Lieutenant Jack Roosevelt Robinson, a college athlete from Pasadena, California, had been commissioned as a cavalry officer and reassigned to the 761st as a morale and athletic officer. He was 25 years old, physically remarkable, and he had already decided that he would not accept the small daily humiliations that segregated service demanded. On July 6, 1944, Robinson boarded a military bus at Camp Hood after visiting the Segregated Officers Club. The bus driver ordered him to move to the rear. Robinson refused. The Army had only a few months earlier issued a directive banning racial discrimination on military transport, and Robinson knew it. The driver called the military police. Robinson was arrested. Charges were filed later that month, and in August 1944, he faced a general court-martial on counts that included insubordination and conduct unbecoming an officer. He was acquitted in November 1944 by an all-white panel, but the process took him out of the training pipeline. When the 761st sailed for Europe, Robinson stayed behind. He would leave the Army the following year, and in 1947, break the color line in Major League Baseball with the Brooklyn Dodgers. His absence from the battalion in combat is one of the great what-ifs of the war, but the point of the Camp Hood incident for the 761st was simpler. It was proof to every man in the battalion that the country they were being asked to fight for still did not consider them equal soldiers, and that even an officer's commission would not shield them from a bus driver's order. By the autumn of 1944, George S. Patton's Third Army had a problem the Army War College report had never anticipated. The drive across France from the Cobra breakout in late July and the Third Army's activation on August 1, 1944, had been the fastest sustained advance in American military history. But the Lorraine campaign, launched in September against the fortified belt around Metz, had ground the Third Army down. Rain turned the fields into knee-deep mud. The German First Army, reinforced by fresh armor and dug into hills the Wehrmacht had spent years fortifying, fought back street by street and pillbox by pillbox. Third Army tank losses through September and October ran into the hundreds. Patton needed replacement armor faster than the theater could deliver it, and independent tank battalions attached to infantry divisions for direct support were the type of unit he needed most. The 761st had arrived in England in late August 1944 and had been sitting in a staging area near Wimborne, waiting. Every other combat-ready independent tank battalion in the European theater had already been committed. The 761st was the only one left. In early October 1944, with Third Army short of armor, Patton requested the unit from 12th Army Group. General Omar Bradley approved the assignment. Whatever Patton's private views on race, and his diaries and letters record views that were sometimes ugly, his views on winning battles were absolute. He needed tanks, and he needed crews trained to use them. On October 10, 1944, the 761st landed at Omaha Beach more than 4 months after the invasion and began the long road march east through liberated France toward the Third Army front. They reached the assembly area near Saint-Nicolas-de-Port, a small town south of Nancy in Lorraine, in the final days of October. On the morning of November 2, 1944, the battalion was drawn up in formation. Patton delivered the short address that has been preserved in multiple first-hand accounts, including those of Trezvant Anderson, the Black War correspondent who traveled with the unit and later wrote the battalion's first history, Come Out Fighting. Patton told them that men had been calling him a fool for fighting for their assignment. He told them he did not care what color they were as long as they went up there and killed those Kraut sons of bitches. He told them that everyone had their eyes on them and expected great things of them. Most importantly, he told them not to let him down and not to let their race down. Then he stepped down and the 761st went to war. 6 days later, before dawn on November 8, 1944, in a cold rain that had turned the fields around the village of Morville-le-Vic into a swamp of red Lorraine clay, the tanks of the 761st Tank Battalion started their engines and rolled toward the German lines. They had one day to prove that the last 20 years of Army doctrine had been wrong. The Camp Claiborne period deserves closer attention because it shaped every man who would later climb into a Sherman in Lorraine. The battalion drew its enlisted men from across the country, but a disproportionate number came from the industrial North, from cities like Chicago, Detroit, and Cleveland, where black men had found factory work in the Depression years and where the mechanical familiarity the Army War College had denied them was a matter of daily life. Sergeant Warren G.H. Crecy, a soft-spoken 20-year-old from Corpus Christi, Texas, arrived in the battalion in 1942 as a driver. Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers, born in 9918 in the small town of Tecumseh, Oklahoma, one of 13 children of a sharecropping family with African American and Cherokee heritage, arrived the same year and was assigned as a tank commander. Captain David J. Williams, a white officer from Pennsylvania and a Yale graduate, took command of Able Company. These four men, Bates, Rivers, Crecy, and Williams, would carry much of the burden of what came next. The gunnery scores the battalion posted at Camp Hood in 1943 and 1944 were consistently in the upper range for Army tank battalions, and the maneuver evaluations rated the unit ready for overseas deployment by the spring of 1944. And yet the movement orders did not come. Other tank battalions activated after the 761st shipped out first. Bates went to Washington personally to press the case. The delay was not accidental. It was policy, and it was defended inside the War Department by officers who continued to cite the 1925 report almost 20 years after it had been written. What broke the policy was not moral pressure. It was the casualty lists coming out of Normandy and Lorraine in the summer and early fall of 1944. Patton's decision to accept the battalion in October 1944 has sometimes been portrayed as a change of heart. It was not. It was a commander taking the unit that was available because he needed it. What matters historically is not why he took them, but what he did once they were his. He committed them to combat within a week of their arrival at the front. He attached them to the 26th Infantry Division, a Yankee division from New England that had itself been in heavy fighting since October. He gave them the same missions he gave every other tank battalion in 3rd Army. He did not hold them in reserve, did not use them as a demonstration unit, did not shelter them from the hardest fighting. That, more than the words spoken at Saint-Nicolas-de-Port, was the decision that mattered. The bad news for the 761st and for the 26th Division Infantry they would support was that the German defenders in front of them had also been reinforced. Elephants of the 11th Panzer Division, one of the more experienced armored formations in the Wehrmacht, held sectors of the line. The village of Morville-les-Vic sat inside a belt of prepared anti-tank positions with dug-in Panzerfaust teams, mined approaches, and clear fields of fire across the flooded fields. The M4 Sherman with its 75mm gun could deal with older German armor at close range, but it could not reliably penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at any range that mattered, and it burned when it was hit. American tankers had already given the Sherman a nickname that fall. They called it the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter that lit every time. That was the tactical picture on the evening of November 7, 1944, as the 761st moved into its jump-off positions. The battalion had trained for more than 2.5 years to get to this line of departure. They had waited while other units went first. They had absorbed the daily insult of segregated service in a country whose government had told them they were fighting for freedom. And now, in the cold Lorraine mud, they were about to find out what the Sherman could and could not do against a dug-in enemy who did not care about the color of the crew inside. The attack opened at dawn on November 8, 1944, as part of Third Army's general offensive against the Metz fortifications and the German positions in Lorraine. Able Company of the 761st, commanded by Captain David J. Williams, led the battalion into the assault alongside infantry from the 104th Infantry Regiment of the 26th Division. The ground was worse than the reconnaissance photographs had suggested. Overnight rain had raised the standing water in the fields around Morville-les-Vicq to a foot in places, and the Lorraine clay under it clung to the tank tracks like wet cement. Shermans that tried to leave the roads bogged down. Shermans that stayed on the roads were channelized into predictable lanes that German anti-tank gunners had already ranged. The German defenders belonged to elements of the 11th Panzer Division and supporting Volksgrenadier units, and they had been fortifying the ground for weeks. The 1st Sherman was hit within minutes of crossing the line of departure. A concealed 75mm anti-tank gun on the flank fired at close range and killed the tank commander outright. Lieutenant Colonel Paul L. Bates was struck by German fire on the first day of the assault and severely wounded. He was evacuated to a field aid station and later to a hospital in the rear. He would eventually return to the battalion, but he was out of the fight for the crucial opening weeks in Lorraine. Command passed to Major Charles Wingo, who himself would be relieved after only a few days, and then to Captain John F. George, who steadied the battalion under fire. The fighting for Morville-les-Vicq and the neighboring villages of Vic-sur-Seille and Moyenvic went on for 4 days. The battalion learned in those days what every American tank battalion had already learned that autumn. The Sherman with its short 75mm gun could not defeat German armor from the front at fighting range. It could brew up almost any target if it could get a flank shot, and it could level a house with high explosive rounds in support of infantry, but a head-on duel with a Panther was a duel the Sherman would lose. The battalion's answer was the answer other American tank battalions had improvised. They worked in pairs, one tank fixing the enemy while another maneuvered for a side shot. They stayed close to their infantry and used the infantry to hunt Panzerfaust teams before those teams could hunt them. They fired white phosphorus rounds to blind German gunners while they moved. By the evening of November 11, 1944, the villages had been taken and the 761st had absorbed its first accounting of the war. The battalion counted 24 enlisted men killed and 3 officers dead, with 81 wounded and 44 non-battle casualties from exposure and exhaustion. 14 Shermans had been knocked out. It was a heavy price for 4 days of fighting, but it was in line with what other American tank battalions were paying in Lorraine that November, and the ground had been taken. The 26th Division infantry commanders who had watched the battalion fight sent word up the chain that the 761st was carrying its share of the load. Whatever the doctrine had said before the war, the battalion in Lorraine in November 1944 was a functioning combat unit. Inside that first week, the battalion also produced its first Silver Star recommendations, and among the men who would begin to shape the battalion's reputation in the days ahead was Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers, the tank commander from Tecumseh, Oklahoma. Rivers commanded a Sherman and Able Company under Captain Williams. He was known in the battalion for a quiet steadiness under fire and for a habit of taking the lead tank position without being ordered to. On November 15, 1944, Able Company was ordered to advance on the village of Gebling, part of the continuing Third Army, pushed toward the Sarre River. The road into the village was blocked by a heavy roadblock, a mass of felled trees and mines that would take engineers hours to clear under fire. Rivers, in the lead tank, dismounted under German small arms fire, hooked a steel cable from his Sherman to the obstacle, climbed back inside his tank, and dragged the barricade clear. The company rolled forward. He was recommended for a Silver Star for the action, and Williams processed the paperwork the same day. The morning of November 16 brought the second act of what would become the defining episode of Rivers's war. Able Company was advancing again when Rivers's Sherman struck a mine. The blast tore through the front of the tank and mangled his right leg from the knee down. Medics who reached him described bone exposed through the wound and heavy bleeding. The battalion aid station offered morphine and evacuation. Rivers refused both. He took a field dressing from a medic, wrapped the wound himself, and had his crew transfer him to another Sherman in the company. He resumed command of a tank. Williams argued with him and lost. Rivers was still standing, still able to give fire commands, and he intended to stay with his company. He remained in the line for the next 3 days. On November 19, 1944, Able Company approached the villages of Gebling and Borgeltroff, moving through open ground toward a tree line the Germans held with dug-in armor. As the company advanced, German Panthers, most likely from the 11th Panzer Division sector, opened fire from concealed positions in the woods. 2 American tanks were hit almost immediately. Williams ordered the company to withdraw and take cover. Rivers, in the lead again, radioed back that he had spotted the German positions and would engage to cover the withdrawal. Williams gave the order to pull back a second time. Rivers acknowledged and stayed. His Sherman put fire on the German positions to draw attention away from the tanks that were extracting behind him. A Panther round struck his turret. The tank burned. Ruben Rivers was killed in the vehicle he had refused to leave 3 days earlier. Captain David J. Williams began writing a Medal of Honor recommendation for Rivers that same evening. He submitted it through the battalion, up through the 26th Division, and into the 3rd Army personnel system. The paperwork, by every subsequent accounting, entered channels. It then disappeared. No Black American soldier was awarded the Medal of Honor for service in the Second World War during the war or in the decades immediately after it, and Williams would spend much of the rest of his life trying to correct that record for Ruben Rivers. While the fighting around Gebling was unfolding, the strategic map of Europe was about to be rewritten by a German operation the Allies had not seen coming. On December 16, 1944, 3 German armies attacked through the Ardennes forest into the thinly held sector of the American First Army, driving a bulge into the Allied line that gave the battle its name. Bastogne, a road junction town in Belgium held by the 101st Airborne Division and elements of the 10th Armored Division, was surrounded by December 21. Patton, at a command conference at Verdun on December 19, told Eisenhower he could turn the entire Third Army 90 degrees to the north and attack into the flank of the German penetration within days. Almost no one believed it was logistically possible. Patton did it. The 761st was pulled out of the Sarre sector and thrown into the movement. On December 31, 1944, the battalion was attached to the 87th Infantry Division, one of the formations Patton was feeding into the southern shoulder of the Bulge. The march north was made in weather that would define the campaign in the memory of every American who fought in it. Temperatures dropped below zero. Fuel lines froze. The oil in the Sherman engines thickened until crews had to build small fires beneath the tanks to warm them enough to start. Snow drifted across the roads faster than plows could clear it. The battalion moved through the Belgian villages of Notham and Tillet in early January 1945, fighting through terrain where German Volksgrenadier units and remnants of Panzer formations were dug into farmhouses and tree lines. At Tillet, from January 4 through January 7, 1945, the 761st fought one of its longest sustained engagements of the war, supporting the 87th Division's advance against elements of the Führer-Begleit Brigade and remnants of German armored formations withdrawing across the sector. The village changed hands more than once. Sherman crews learned that white camouflage paint, hastily applied over olive drab, flaked off in combat and gave them away. They learned that a stopped tank in the snow was a target the moment it stopped. They kept moving. When the Bulge was closed at the end of January 1945 and the German Ardennes offensive had failed, the 761st had been in continuous combat in some of the worst winter conditions American soldiers faced in Europe for more than 2 months without relief. The battalion had also produced, in that winter fighting, one of the more extraordinary combat records of any American tanker in the war. Sergeant Warren G.H. Crecy, the driver from Corpus Christi, had transferred to a gunner seat by the time the battalion reached the Ardennes. During the Lorraine fighting, his tank had been knocked out under him. He had climbed onto a Jeep, mounted its .50 caliber machine gun, and continued the fight, engaging German anti-tank crews who were still trying to complete the destruction of the American tanks around him. On a later occasion, again after his tank was disabled, Crecy left the vehicle under fire to clear a fouled machine gun in the open and to direct artillery onto German positions himself. The men of the battalion called him the baddest man in the 761st. Officers who saw what he did recommended him for the Medal of Honor. Like the recommendation for Rivers, the paperwork went into the system and did not come out. Crecy would finish the war as one of the most decorated enlisted men in Third Army and would receive a battlefield commission, but the highest award would not come. By late February 1945, the Bulge was over, and the Third Army was moving east again toward the western border of Germany itself. The strategic problem now shifting into focus was the West Wall, the belt of German fortifications the Americans called the Siegfried Line, which ran from the Netherlands south along the German frontier to the Swiss border. It had been built in the late 1930s, upgraded in 1944, and manned by whatever the Wehrmacht had left. In the Saar sector, opposite Third Army, the line consisted of interlocking concrete bunkers, buried Tobruk positions, minefields, and rows of the pyramidal concrete anti-tank obstacles the Germans called Hockerhindernis and the Americans called Dragon's Teeth. Attacking through it with armor meant breaching the teeth, clearing the minefields under fire, and reducing the bunkers one by one with direct fire and infantry assault. The 761st crossed into Germany in mid-March 1945 as part of the Third Army effort to punch through the line and open the way to the Rhine. Between March 20 and March 23, 1945, the battalion supported infantry attacks against fortified positions in the Saarland sector, engaging concrete bunkers with 75mm high explosive fire at ranges close enough that the crews could see the muzzle flashes of the German machine guns firing back through the embrasures. Engineers blew gaps in the Dragon's Teeth. Sherman tanks nosed through the gaps, one at a time, exposed to any anti-tank guns still in action on the far side. The line held in places for hours. In other places, it collapsed in minutes as the defenders, many of them older reservists or teenage draftees from the Volkssturm, surrendered when the American armor closed the distance. By the end of March 1945, the West Wall in the Third Army sector had been broken. The 761st crossed the Rhine on March 31 at the American bridgehead near Mainz, part of the general Allied crossing of the last great river barrier in Western Europe. The battalion had now fought its way from the Moselle to the Rhine, through winter, through the Bulge, through fortifications the Wehrmacht had spent years preparing. The road east was open. Ahead of them lay central Germany, the collapse of the Third Reich, and the discovery at a place none of them had heard of what the war had actually been fought against. The tactical lessons the 761st absorbed in its first week at Morville-les-Vicq hardened into standard operating procedure through the rest of November 1944. Captain John F. George, holding the battalion together after Bates was wounded and Wingo was relieved, reorganized the company teams so that Shermans routinely moved in overwatching pairs and never crossed open ground without infantry sweeping the flanks. The battalion's assault gun platoon, equipped with M4 Shermans mounting the short 105mm howitzer, was pushed forward to give the line companies immediate high explosive support against bunkers and stone farmhouses. The light tank company, still equipped with the M5 Stuart, was used for reconnaissance and flank security, its 37mm gun useless against German armor but adequate against infantry positions and soft-skinned vehicles. These adjustments were not battalion inventions. They were the accumulated wisdom of every American tank battalion in the European theater that autumn. The 761st adopted them under fire and paid for them in the same coin every other battalion was paying. The scale of what the battalion faced in the villages between the Selle and the Sarre in late November is worth stating in specifics. The 26th Division, to which the 761st was attached for most of this period, took more than 3,000 battle casualties in November, 1,944 alone, and the tank battalion's losses were proportionate to the intensity of the ground the division was crossing. German counterattacks, sometimes at battalion strength, hit the American line almost daily in the sector around Dieuze and Benestroff. The 761st Baker Company under Captain Charles A. Gates and Charlie Company each rotated through the lead role as Able Company was rebuilt after the losses around Gubbling. Replacement tanks arrived from 3rd Army depots in 2s and 3s. Replacement crews were assigned from the pool of trained but combat inexperienced black tankers who had followed the battalion to Europe. The Bulge itself is often remembered in American memory as the story of Bastogne and the 101st Airborne, but the southern shoulder that Patton drove north to attack was held together by a patchwork of infantry divisions and independent tank battalions, of which the 761st was one. The 87th Infantry Division, to which the battalion was attached, had itself been in Europe barely a month when the German offensive began. It was a green division fighting an experienced enemy in terrain the Germans had chosen. The 761st Shermans gave the 87th its armored punch. At Notham and Tillet in early January, the battalion's tanks moved down narrow forest roads where the trees closed overhead and where a knocked-out Sherman blocked the road for every tank behind it. Crews rode with their hatches open in below-zero air because a closed hatch on a hit tank meant a crew that did not get out. The move from the Bulge to the West Wall in February and March 1945 was itself a small campaign, fought against a Wehrmacht that was disintegrating in some places and fighting to the last cartridge in others. The 761st was attached at various times during this period to the 17th Airborne Division and the 95th Infantry Division, moving from one attachment to the next as 3rd Army shifted its weight. Independent tank battalions in the American Army had been designed for exactly this kind of use, but few battalions in the theater were pushed as continuously from attachment to attachment, and fewer still absorbed as many combat days without a formal rest period. By the time the battalion crossed the Rhine on March 31, 1945, it had been in near continuous combat since November 8 of the previous year, a stretch of nearly 5 months, during which its Shermans had rarely been out of range of German guns for more than a few days at a time. The road east was open, and the campaign that would end at the edge of the Alps was about to begin. Central Germany in April 1945 was a landscape of collapse. Wehrmacht units surrendered by the hundreds and then by the thousands. Other units, sometimes only a few streets away, fought on with the fanaticism of men who had nowhere left to go. The 761st Tank Battalion, still attached to shifting infantry formations under 3rd Army, drove east and then south through Bavaria, taking towns, accepting surrenders, and occasionally engaging German rearguards that had not yet been told the war was over. By the last week of April, the battalion was pushing into Austria as part of the 3rd Army drive toward Linz and the Enns River. The line agreed with the Soviet Union as the meeting point of the two advancing fronts. On May 4 and May 5, 1945, elements of the 761st, operating with the 71st Infantry Division, reached the vicinity of the town of Lambach in Upper Austria. A short distance to the northeast, in a stretch of forest near the village of Gunskirchen, American troops came upon a camp the Germans had established only weeks earlier as a subcamp of the Mauthausen concentration camp complex. Gunskirchen had been used to hold thousands of Hungarian Jews force-marched from other camps in the final weeks of the war. When the Americans arrived, the survivors, an estimated 15,000 to 17,000 people, were dying at a rate of hundreds a day from typhus, dysentery, and starvation. The dead lay unburied in the woods. The living could barely stand. Soldiers of the 71st Division and the tank crews of the 761st, operating in the same sector, passed through the area in the following hours and saw what the war had actually been fought against in a form that no briefing and no newspaper had prepared them for. The men handing water and rations through the wire were Black American tankers who had been told most of their lives that they were not fully citizens of the country whose uniform they wore. The people they were feeding had been told by the government that had built the camp that they were not fully human. The meeting of those two facts in the Austrian woods in the first week of May 1945 was one of the war's quieter and more exact judgments on the racial doctrines of the 20th century. 2 days later, on May 6, 1945, forward elements of the 761st reached the town of Steyr on the Enns River in Upper Austria. Soviet troops advancing from the east were closing on the same line. The 761st was among the American units that made contact with the Red Army along the Enns, one of the several link-ups that closed the ring around what remained of the Third Reich. 2 days later, on May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The battalions accounting for the campaign, when the staff worked it out in the weeks after VE Day, was heavy. The 761st had been in continuous or near continuous combat from November 8, 1944 to May 6, 1945, a total of 183 days at the front. It was the longest combat record of any independent tank battalion in 3rd Army. The unit had fought through 5 countries: France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Germany, and Austria. It had been credited with the capture or clearing of more than 30 towns and villages, the destruction of hundreds of enemy machine gun positions, and the elimination of substantial numbers of German armored vehicles, anti-tank guns, and vehicles of every description. Battalion casualties for the campaign came to more than 30% of its strength, with roughly 36 men killed in action and more than 250 wounded. The battalion had earned dozens of Silver Stars and hundreds of Bronze Stars in 8 months of fighting. What it did not receive in 1945 was the recognition its combat record warranted. A Presidential Unit Citation, the highest award for a unit action, was recommended for the battalion for its combat record from Lorraine to Austria. It was denied. No public explanations was ever offered, but the pattern was consistent with how the wartime Army treated Black combat units in general. 2 other African American units, the 969th Field Artillery Battalion and the 92nd Infantry Division, saw their own recognition delayed or reduced along similar lines. The men of the 761st came home in the summer and fall of 1945 were mustered out into a country that was still, in most of its states, legally segregated, and went back to the cities and small towns they had left 3 or 4 years earlier. The tank commander from Chicago went back to Chicago. The gunner from Corpus Christi went back to Texas. The recommendations for Ruben Rivers and for Warren G. H. Crecy, filed in the field by officers who had watched what they did, sat in Army files. The correction took a generation and then another one. Tresvant Anderson, the war correspondent, published Come Out Fighting in Germany in the summer of 1945, the first history of the battalion, printed for the men themselves. Veterans of the 761st formed an association and pressed through the 1950s, the 1960s, and the 1970s for the Presidential Unit Citation that had been denied. The case was reopened in the Army in the mid-1970s. On April 10, 1978, President Jimmy Carter, in a ceremony at the White House, awarded the Presidential Unit Citation to the 761st Tank Battalion for extraordinary heroism in action during the period of October 31, 1944 to May 6, 1945. 33 years after the fighting in Lorraine, the record was corrected. The larger correction came in the 1990s. In 9993, the United States Army commissioned a study by Shaw University, a historically black university in Raleigh, North Carolina, to examine whether racial discrimination had affected the awarding of the Medal of Honor in the Second World War. The Army had awarded 464 Medals of Honor for actions in that war. None had gone to African American service members. The Shaw University research team, working through service records, unit histories, and award recommendations, concluded that the omission was not the result of black soldiers failing to earn the award. It was the result of a system that had not been willing to give it to them. The team identified 10 African American servicemen whose actions met the standard for the Medal of Honor. The Army recommended 7 of those cases for approval. On January 13, 1997, President Bill Clinton, in a White House ceremony, awarded the Medal of Honor to 7 African American veterans of the Second World War. 6 of the awards were posthumous. The 7th went to First Lieutenant Vernon Baker of the 92nd Infantry Division, the only one of the 7 still living. Among the 6 posthumous awards was the Medal of Honor for Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers of the 761st Tank Battalion for his actions at Gebling and Borgaltroff on November 15 through 1944. The citation described the clearing of the roadblock under fire, the refusal of evacuation after his tank struck the mine, the 3 days of continued command with a shattered leg, and the decision to hold his position on November 19 to cover the withdrawal of his company. Captain David J. Williams, who had written the original recommendation in the field in 9944 and who had spent the better part of 5 decades pressing for its consideration, was present at the ceremony. Rivers' sisters received the medal on his behalf. The question this story set out to answer can now be answered directly. Patton asked for the 761st Tank Battalion in October 1944 because his Third Army needed armor and because the 761st was the only trained, combat-ready independent tank battalion in the European theater not already committed. His personal views on race, recorded in his own diaries and letters, did not enter the decision. What entered the decision was the casualty list from Lorraine and the fact that the men of the 761st had been waiting, trained and ready, for more than 2 years. The battalion answered the question of whether black Americans could fight as armored soldiers by doing it for 183 days against the same enemy on the same terms as every other American tank battalion in Third Army. The doctrine written into the Army War College report in 1925 did not survive the winter of 1944 and 1945 in Lorraine, in the Ardennes, or at the West Wall. The paperwork that would formally acknowledge what the battalion had done took another 52 years to catch up with the fighting. When it did, in January 1997, the words spoken by Patton in Lorraine in November 1944, and the words spoken about Ruben Rivers in the East Room of the White House in January 1997 describe the same set of facts on the ground. The distance between those 2 dates is the actual measure of how long the United States took to accept the record its own soldiers had written under fire.